I'm Dan Rodricks, and you're listening to Midday. Too big to fail, a phrase from the financial collapse of 2008, is still regarded as a problem with the free market system, where corporations and banks operate on a global scale. But what some see as a problem, others see as the way the world really works, for now and forever. In the second of 2 hours devoted to the future of global power, we speak today with David Rothkopf, CEO and editor-at-large of Foreign Policy, about the increasing dominance of private corporations around the globe, from Walmart to the secretive New York asset manager BlackRock. David Rothkopf surveys the rivalry between big business and big government, financial crisis, growing inequality, and how the world is really run. Part 2 of the future of global power on Midday, after the news. And welcome back to Midday, everyone. Dan Rodricks here. Thanks again for joining us today and sticking around for our second hour. President Obama hosts leaders of the Group of 8 nations at Camp David in Western Maryland for an economic summit that's coming up May 18th, 19th. Ahead of that event, Midday has been taking a look at the future of global power. Yesterday, we spoke with Charles Kupchan of the Council on Foreign Relations about the big realignment of economic and political power taking place in the world. You can hear that conversation at wypr.org. Look for the Midday Show podcast archive. Today, in the second of 2 hours devoted to this subject of the future of global power, we speak with David Rothkopf, a CEO and editor-at-large of Foreign Policy, about the increasing dominance of private corporations around the globe, from Walmart to the secretive New York asset manager, BlackRock. David Rothkopf's latest book is Power Incorporated, The Epic Rivalry Between Big Business and Government and the Reckoning That Lies Ahead, a survey of the financial crisis, growing inequality, the international system, the broken international system, you might say, and how the world is really run. David Rothkopf was earlier the author of Superclass, The Global Power Elite and the World They Are Making, and Running the World, the inside story of the National Security Council and the architects of American power. He is the president and chief executive of Garton Rothkopf, an international advisory firm, a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and, as I said earlier, CEO and editor-at-large of the FP Group, which is the publishers of Foreign Policy, the magazine in print and online, with which we've collaborated earlier on midday programs on foreign news and trend. So it's a great pleasure to get David Rothkopf on the show with us today. Nice to have you joining us, David.
Glad to be here.
And it's 7 o'clock tonight. I believe that's the hour when you'll be at the Enoch Pratt Library in Baltimore.
Yes.
That's tonight.
I look forward to it.
Yeah, that's tonight. Well, thank you very much. I wanted to jump right in here to the Walmart story, if you don't mind, and because it's been in the news lately, an alleged bribery scheme, a vast bribery scheme by Walmart in Mexico. And there's been news stories, other news stories related to this that have broken since the New York Times first reported this story of a Justice Department investigation and an internal whistleblower alleging bribes, some $24 million in bribes that Walmart officials gave in Mexico in order to get their stores developed down there. And I don't know, this story just comes to mind here as I was reading your book and preparing for this show today, because Walmart does figure in the stories that you tell in Power Incorporated. But I mean, what do you make of this particular story and the facts? What could you say about that in the context of Power Incorporated and your premise of this book?
Well, first of all, I think the story is in the category of dog bites man. This happens a lot. When I was in the Clinton administration in the 90s, we undertook a big study, classified study, of how companies and countries competed worldwide and what illegal practices they used. And you would be surprised, or perhaps you wouldn't, but the scale of it would shock you that bribery is simply one of the tools in the toolbox Until not too long ago, in Europe, you were allowed to deduct bribes as part of the taxable business business expenses of a corporation.
That's right.
In many parts of the world, the brown paper bag full of cash, the suitcase full of cash, the wire transfer to a personal account, provision of certain kinds of services, that's just the way business is done. And I would say, by the way, before we get up on our high horses about it here in the United States, we have a pretty corrupt system too. It's just we do it in a much more sophisticated way within certain legal parameters. But it's hard to say that in the U.S., when people leave government and get big, high-paying jobs, or they're getting certain money for campaigns or other kind of benefits accrue to people who are former senior officials, that we don't have a system that also involves payoffs of one sort or another.
Mm-hmm. The story of Walmart, though, the one you present in your book, is just its scale, its size, the sales revenues of the world's. This is the world's largest company, Walmart Stores Incorporated, higher than the GDPs of all but 25 countries. And that's not news to a lot of people who just heard me say that. They've heard this stated before. But, when you stand back and think about that for a moment, it is stunning. And I just want you to take a moment here to explain why we need to pay attention to this.
Well, it's because, this is not the way the world was supposed to work. It's not the way you were taught it in class. What we were taught was that countries, which were at least ideally representative of the interests of the people within their borders, were the actors who were determining the way that global power was distributed and how global problems were solved. But what's happened over the course of the past several hundred years is that a new class of actors have emerged on the global stage that are better at being global than the countries are. They're designed for it. They're immortal. They have greater resources than most countries do. There are probably 2,000 companies that have more economic resources than the smallest 100 or so countries, and they've got a massive amount of tools at their disposal. People who will quibble with using GDP to, compare versus sales of a company will say, well, these aren't the same, and they're right. But they're not right in the way that they mean, because, think about it. The GDP of a country is a lot of that is economic value creation that actually goes to companies that are based someplace else. The economic power of a country is really only in its federal budget, which is a fraction of that GDP. And most federal budgets, like the U.S. budget, are mostly sort of go into obligations of the country. So there's very little discretionary wealth. So if you think of, the discretionary income or the discretionary resources available to a country and compare it to what's available to Walmart or to Exxon or to, any giant corporation that you can think of, it's much, much greater on the part of the companies, and the companies operate in more places around the world. They influence more political outcomes. They employ more people. I think if you take the number of people who work for Walmart, it's greater than the population of a couple of dozen countries.
You say that these companies, the multinationals, these global companies of this size, practice a foreign policy sort of their own. What do you mean by that?
Well, as with any foreign policy, it's got multiple dimensions. When the world's nations gathered in Copenhagen to decide whether or not they would reach an accord on climate, companies like Exxon and other big companies from energy industry, gathered there and made their case and had their lobbyists in and around the room and promised campaign donations to people and influenced outcome. That's a kind of foreign policy. When they want to go and tap into the resources of a country, like Equatorial Guinea or something, they go into the country, they give money to the people in the country, they influence the outcomes of the country, they begin to dictate policy in the country. In the case of Shell in West Africa, they put their employees, they seconded them to the government. And then when the government started figuring out what their policies were going to be vis-a-vis the oil business, they neglected to note that those were Shell employees relaying all that information back to Shell. They set their own healthcare policies. They, in some countries, they provide security. or stabilize situations, or actually do the policing that countries would have done in order to ensure that the areas where they're mining or they're cutting down trees or wherever are actually welcoming to them.
I'm going to read an excerpt here from the book and then have you explain, talk a little bit, elaborate. Striking the right balance between private and public power is the fundamental challenge of our age. I think this is so well put here. Find the sweet spot, David Rothkopf writes. Prudent regulation, empowering citizens to compete, fostering economic dynamism and fairness for all, and your society will thrive in the 21st century. If you get that wrong, though, the results will be measured in social instability, diminishing prosperity, and declining ability to shape your destiny. And in regard to the United States here, in particular, this word inequality, economic inequality, we had a conversation with the economist James Galbraith just a couple of weeks ago about this. To what extent is that evidence that things are way out of balance in terms of the power of corporations?
I think it's direct evidence. I mean, first of all, the United States is at a critical moment in its history. We were the example to the world. We were the economy that everybody wanted to be like because we were viewed as a place where opportunity was created that fueled social mobility, that enabled people to rise up. The last decade in U.S. history was the first in U.S. history in which there was net negative job creation. Social mobility fell. Inequality grew. Median incomes for the majority of people in this country fell. Last year, the first year of recovery, 93% of the benefits of the recovery went to the top 1% of the population. 7% went to everybody else. The Walton family that owns Walmart has a net worth that's greater than that of the bottom 150 million or so people in the U.S. economy. So inequality is reaching unprecedented levels in the United States. And if you look for a reason for that, it's because we have a tax code that essentially penalizes people for working for a living and rewards them for investing for a living. We have a tax code that lays off the rich and lays into the poor and the middle class. We have government policies, which a number of major political, subdivisions in the United States are pushing for, that reduce the role of government. And when they say that, they say, well, you're going to create more freedom for people. But of course, if you don't have public schools, people who can't afford private school don't go to school. If you don't have public health care programs, people who can't afford health care don't get health care. The problem with cutting back on government is it cuts back on services that the neediest in society depend upon. And that's been the direction that we've been heading for 30 years. And Democrats and Republicans alike have fueled it. I was in the Clinton administration. We're the ones that got rid of Glass-Steagall. We're the ones that unleashed Wall Street into this sort of rampage of greed and self-satisfaction and casino-like markets that when there were upsets, society at large paid, and when there were victories, only a few people really benefited. So it's not just Republicans, it's not just Democrats, it's that we've bought into a system of values and a series of false choices that are essentially, destroying the American dream.
David Rothkopf is our guest, CEO and editor-at-large at Foreign Policy. One of our favorite websites, by the way. If you haven't been to the FP website, Foreign Policy website, please check it out. It's quite rich, quite good. David Rothkopf will be at the Enoch Pratt Free Library tonight with his book, Power Incorporated, the epic rivalry between big business and government and the reckoning that lies ahead. We'll talk about that reckoning with David Rothkopf after this short break. You're welcome to call in with comments, 410-662-8788.